Have you ever felt like your mind no longer works the way most people's does, and that has started to scare you? As if, all of a sudden, certain conversations have become too shallow, certain environments have become unbearably noisy on the inside, and certain people, far too predictable to keep sparking the same interest. What once seemed normal now feels strange. What once entertained you now drains you. What once went unnoticed now jumps right in front of your eyes. And the most unsettling part is that you can't say exactly when this started. You only know that something changed. Maybe you started noticing patterns in behaviors you used to accept without thinking. Maybe you began to perceive emotional repetitions in people, lies disguised as affection, intentions hidden behind beautiful words, or even internal mechanisms within yourself that used to operate on autopilot. And that creates an uncomfortable feeling, the sense that you are growing more distant from everything. More observant. Quieter. More selective. Harder to convince. The question that inevitably arises is this. Is this maturity, or is your mind entering a process of transformation that almost no one around you would understand? Carl Jung used to say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And maybe that is exactly what is happening to you right now. Parts of reality that once remained hidden have started to become visible. You are not just seeing events. You are seeing patterns. You are seeing structures. You are seeing repetitions. And when the mind begins to recognize patterns, it stops consuming life innocently. It begins to read what lies underneath. That is why so many things have started to feel artificial. That is why so many people have started to feel predictable. That is why your own behavior has started to feel unfamiliar to you. Because recognizing patterns is not just about noticing coincidences. It is a sign that consciousness is trying to reorganize the way you interpret the world. And this process is rarely comfortable. At first, it feels like exhaustion. Then, it feels like isolation. Then, it feels like overthinking. Until you realize it is not just that. There is a silent mental shift taking place. A shift that makes you question relationships, habits, environments, beliefs, and even the version of yourself that used to function before. It is as if your mind is refusing to continue on autopilot. As if some part of you has awakened to things that can no longer be ignored. And the most curious part is that this always leaves traces. Small signs. Specific patterns. Subtle changes in the way you feel, observe, and react. Signs that most people do not even notice, but that reveal when consciousness has started to move out of an ordinary level and into something completely different. And the first of these patterns usually appears exactly when you start feeling strange inside your own routine. Because before we continue, I want to ask you for something very simple, and very important. If at any point in these opening words you felt a strange discomfort, as if this video were describing things you have never been able to explain to anyone, go ahead and leave your like right now. It may seem small, but that gesture helps this message reach other people who are also going through this mental shift in silence and thinking they are alone. And I truly want to understand how deeply this is happening to the people here. So comment below, "My mind has changed," if you already feel like you can no longer see life the way you used to, or comment in your own words what the first sign was that made you realize something inside you is different. I read the comments because, many times, that is where we discover there is an entire network of people going through the same psychological awakening without being able to name it. And if this kind of content stirs deep parts of your consciousness, subscribe to the channel right now. Because the next few minutes will dive deeper into mental patterns that most people ignore, but that may explain exactly why you have been feeling more distant, more observant, and mentally in transition. And the more you understand these signs, the more you realize this did not begin out of nowhere. The first pattern almost always goes unnoticed at the beginning, because it does not arrive as a major rupture. It arrives as a repetitive, silent discomfort that is hard to explain. You keep living your routine, keep talking to the same people, keep going to similar places, but something inside you no longer responds the same way. It is as if your mind is present, but your tolerance is gone. Conversations that used to feel normal begin to feel too long. Topics that once filled the time begin to feel empty. Automatic laughter, predictable opinions, repeated complaints, social superficiality, everything starts producing a kind of invisible weariness. And you try to adapt. You try to fake interest. You try to participate. You try to keep up. But deep down, you feel that you are making an effort to fit into experiences that once flowed effortlessly. This is one of the first signs of mental change, when autopilot stops numbing you. Because most people live in the continuous motion of repetition without questioning much. They repeat conversations, repeat bonds, repeat distractions, repeat emotional responses. And they manage to stay there because the mind still accepts the surface as enough. But when your consciousness begins to shift, the surface loses its effect. You begin to feel the emptiness of what once distracted you. And that is profoundly uncomfortable. Because the first interpretation is usually, something is wrong with me. Maybe I am becoming boring. Maybe I am becoming antisocial. Maybe I am withdrawing from everything. But what if that is not it? What if the problem is not a lack of interest in life, but an excess of perception about the lack of depth in certain experiences? Carl Jung spoke of the expansion of consciousness as something that breaks old identifications. In other words, what you once identified with begins to lose its grip. What used to fill you no longer fills you. What used to convince you no longer convinces you. What used to make you feel like you belonged no longer produces the same sensation. It is like changing frequencies without physically changing places. On the outside, everything looks the same. On the inside, nothing fits the same. And this generates a very specific kind of loneliness, the loneliness of being present without being truly connected. You are in the conversation circle, but mentally distant. You are listening, but not immersed. You are among people, but with the feeling that something essential is missing. And the more this happens, the more you begin to notice something unsettling. It is not just boredom. It is perception. You begin to notice how automatic certain interactions are. How conditioned certain statements are. How many behaviors are repeated almost like emotional scripts. People tell the same stories with different characters. They seek the same validation in different forms. They react with the same mechanisms without realizing it. And your mind catches that. Catches it and grows tired. Because when you begin to see too much repetition, the novelty of the surface dies quickly. Maybe that is why, lately, you have felt a strange desire for silence. Not necessarily sadness. Silence. Less noise. Less empty conversation. Less useless stimulation. Less need to perform presence. As if your mind were asking for space to process something that has not yet become language. That inner request matters. Because it does not come out of nowhere. It comes when some part of consciousness begins to reject excess distraction and seek interpretation. Interpretation of the world. Interpretation of people. Interpretation of yourself. But at this stage, you still do not understand what is happening. You only feel the friction. You feel more selective. You feel more impatient. You feel that certain connections seem insufficient. And above all, you feel that the way you perceive has started changing even before you had words to explain that change. That is where the most curious detail comes in. This initial discomfort does not usually come alone. Right after it, the mind starts doing something even stranger. It begins identifying hidden repetitions in everything around you, as if it were building an invisible map of reality. If this has already happened to you, comment, "Nothing distracts me anymore," or "I feel this emptiness." There are certain phrases that already reveal what stage the mind is in. And when this phase begins to advance, something happens that leaves many people genuinely confused. You stop looking at isolated events and start seeing the repetitions behind them. It is as if your mind, without asking permission, starts connecting dots all the time. Someone tells you a story and you do not just hear the story, you recognize the emotional pattern behind it. Someone promises something and you do not just hear the promise, you compare it with the behavior, the tone, the inconsistency, the previous signs. A relationship begins and, before much even happens, you already sense where it is likely heading. That feels frightening because it seems like overanalysis. But in practice, it is increased perception. You begin to notice that a lot of things are not random. The same dynamics appear in different faces. The same manipulations appear in different speeches. The same emotional voids appear in different forms of affection. And suddenly, social life stops feeling like a sequence of spontaneous events. It begins to feel like a system of repeated patterns. Maybe that is why, at some point, you had the impression that you can predict people. Not predict in some mystical sense. Predict because repetition becomes visible. You see someone trying too hard to appear good and you already sense the need for validation. You see someone exaggerating rapid connection and you already sense neediness or control. You see someone always placing themselves as the victim and you already recognize avoidance of responsibility. Your mind is no longer buying only the verbal narrative. It is reading the entire design. And that creates a very strange sensation, the feeling that the world has become less surprising and more decipherable. But at the same time, more exhausting. Because when you begin to see the hidden script, you lose part of the innocence that once made interactions feel light. You already walk into environments perceiving who wants approval, who wants attention, who is uncomfortable, who is competing, who is masking insecurity. You read microbehaviors. You read pauses. You read exaggerations. You read contradictions. Without realizing it, your mind starts working in the background all the time. And that creates a huge internal conflict, because one part of you thinks, "Am I becoming too critical?" But another part knows it is not just criticism. It is recognition. It is raw psychological reading. Carl Jung believed that what is not consciously seen continues to manifest itself through symbols, repetitions, and automatic behaviors. That means people reveal far more than they imagine without ever having to say it explicitly. The unconscious leaks out. It leaks through word choice. It leaks through the kind of relationships they keep repeating. It leaks through the kind of lies they tell themselves. It leaks through the emotional patterns they insist on calling bad luck. And when your mind starts noticing that leakage, everything changes. Because you stop reacting only to the visible fact. You begin reacting to the invisible pattern. It is no longer, "This person did this." It becomes, "This person operates this way." It is no longer, "This situation happened." It becomes, "This dynamic always forms like this." That shift is enormous. Because the person who notices events suffers because of the event. But the person who notices patterns understands that the event is only the manifestation of something larger. And then an inevitable effect appears: you begin trusting immediate appearances less. Less trust in polished speeches. Less trust in declared intentions. Less trust in the initial excitement of things. You begin waiting for consistency. You begin observing repetition. You begin looking for what remains when the performance drops. That makes you more selective, quieter, and often more misunderstood. Because those who still live on the surface think you are overcomplicating. when in reality, you are simply seeing connections you did not see before. But this is where it becomes even more uncomfortable. Because noticing patterns in other people and situations is only the first half of the change. There is a next stage where the mind starts realizing that this same mechanism of repetition is also happening inside you, and that is where psychological awakening stops being external observation and turns into internal confrontation. If this makes sense to you, comment, "I see repetitions," or "I notice the script." These small phrases say a lot about the kind of mental reading that is taking shape. And when you finally realize that these patterns are not just in people, but in the entire structure of the reality around you, the feeling is almost disturbing. It feels as though you stepped out of life and started observing it from the outside. As if before you simply participated, and now you analyze. Before, you reacted. Now, you compare. Before, you accepted certain narratives. Now, you examine what is holding each narrative up. Before, many things seemed spontaneous. Now, many things seem predictably constructed. This is the point where the mind starts abandoning collective autopilot. And this is exactly where Carl Jung's theory fits with striking force. Jung said that most of humanity lives guided by unconscious contents, inherited conditioning, repeated emotional responses, and psychic mechanisms that are rarely examined. A person believes they are choosing freely. But many times they are simply obeying invisible internal patterns. When you begin to perceive this, not only in others but in the general logic of human relationships, something breaks. Naivety breaks. You understand that many conflicts are not about what they appear to be. That many loves are not love, but emotional compensation. That many friendships are not connection, but psychic convenience. That many opinions are not independent thought, but the reflection of social programming. And that gives you a strange kind of vertigo. Because the mind starts asking all the time, how many things around me are genuinely real? That question changes the way you exist in the world. You begin watching people defend certainties they have never questioned. You watch people repeat behaviors they swear are personal choices. You watch emotional cycles being called coincidence. And everything seems to obey an invisible machinery. It is almost like watching a play where many still believe they are improvising, while you begin to see the script. But that does not immediately bring a sense of superiority. It brings unease. Because seeing the script makes it hard to simply relax inside the play. You hear an argument and already see the ego behind it. You hear a promise and already see the need behind it. You hear someone pull away and already see the fear behind it. The surface stops being convincing. And this gradually distances you emotionally from the common way of living. You start speaking less because you realize how much conversation is automatic. You start observing more because you see more information in silence than in speech. You start trusting slowly because you already understand how social masks work. Without realizing it, your mind is reorganizing itself for deep reading. Not the reading of facts. The reading of psychic patterns. The reading of human repetitions. The reading of invisible forces that drive behavior. And this is an unmistakable sign of mental transformation, when life stops being merely experience and starts becoming conscious interpretation. But there is one brutal detail in this. The more your mind interprets, the less it can return to its previous innocence. You can no longer unsee. You can no longer pretend you do not notice. You can no longer consume relationships, environments, and narratives with the same passivity. And this is where many people enter crisis. Because they begin to think, am I becoming too disconnected? Maybe. But not in the way you imagine. You are not only disconnecting from people. You are disconnecting from unconsciousness. And this process tends to be lonely, because those who are still comfortable on the surface rarely understand someone who has started seeing depth in everything. That is why comes that feeling of being among many and, even so, existing on another mental layer. As if your mind were a few steps behind what is visible, and a few steps ahead of what is obvious. But the most intense part has not even begun yet. Because realizing that the world operates through hidden patterns is impactful, but there is an even more destabilizing experience, when you discover that your own mind is also full of repeated scripts that had never been fully seen. If this hit deep, comment, "I see the script," or "Nothing feels that spontaneous anymore." Sometimes a short phrase already exposes the size of the internal change. And this may be the most uncomfortable part of the entire transformation, realizing that it was not only others living in patterns, you were too. Because there comes a moment when consciousness stops pointing outward and turns inward like a cruel mirror. You begin noticing that many of your reactions did not come from your essence, but from old wounds. That many of your fears did not come from present reality, but from experiences that shaped your perception. That many of your withdrawals, silences, and even emotional explosions were psychic programs being executed without your conscious permission. That is hard to accept. Because until then, it seemed like you simply were this way. But suddenly an uncomfortable question appears. What if much of what I call personality is only adaptation? Carl Jung said that what we do not bring into consciousness returns as fate. In other words, everything that remains hidden inside you continues to command your life, but you call that invisible command coincidence, bad luck, repeated pattern, or even personality. That is why some people always attract the same type of disappointment. That is why certain pains return wearing different faces. That is why some environments always awaken the same anxiety. It is not the entire world conspiring. Many times, it is the psyche reproducing what has not yet been illuminated. When your mind truly begins to change, you start seeing these internal scripts in motion. You realize that certain people affect you because they touch old shadows. You realize that certain criticisms hurt too much because they land on unresolved insecurities. You realize that certain separations destabilize you because they activate primitive fears of abandonment. And the feeling is almost one of shock. Because you understand that you were not only observing the patterns of the world. You were coming into contact with your own labyrinths. This is the point where psychological awakening stops being romantic. Because many people like the idea of having a different mind, being more conscious, seeing beyond. It sounds beautiful. It sounds powerful. But almost no one talks about the price of that. Seeing beyond also means seeing within. And what exists within is not always comfortable. There are self-sabotaging mechanisms. There are emotional compensations. There are masks built to survive. There are characters you wore to be accepted, to avoid suffering, to avoid seeming vulnerable. Suddenly, you begin noticing that even your way of thinking was influenced by versions of you that were born in pain. That shakes identity. Because if you are not only what you believed yourself to be, then who are you without those layers? That question has no immediate answer. And maybe that is why so many people interrupt the process halfway through. Because it is much easier to keep blaming the entire world than to admit that there is a whole unconscious operating behind the curtain. But your mind has already started noticing too much to pretend it did not see. You already notice when you overreact. You already notice when you interpret situations through old filters. You already notice when your fear speaks louder than reality. And this continuous self-observation creates a kind of internal division. One part of you feels. And the other part observes you feeling. One part wants to repeat the pattern. And the other part recognizes the pattern before it finishes. It is as if two levels of consciousness begin to coexist. The old autopilot still tries to act. But a new presence begins witnessing everything. This presence is silent, analytical, and sometimes even exhausting, because it no longer lets you live in the dark without noticing the dark. And although this is uncomfortable, it is exactly here that true mental reconfiguration is born. Because repeated awareness creates rupture. The more you see the mechanism, the less it can act with the same force. But before the complete rupture happens, there is a strange phase where you do not fully recognize yourself either in what you were, or in what you are becoming. You remain in the middle. And that middle is usually confusing. Days when you understand everything and still feel lost. Days when you see your triggers and still fall into them. Days when you clearly perceive the origin of certain behaviors, but still do not know how to dismantle them. It is like watching your own programming in real time without yet having the definitive code to rewrite it. And it is precisely in this phase that many people begin to think they are breaking, when in reality they are crossing the most important stage of psychic change. Because there is a huge difference between suffering on autopilot and suffering with awareness. On autopilot, you repeat. In awareness, you begin to decipher. And when you begin to decipher, something even more surprising emerges, the realization that some of the strongest patterns in your mind were never truly yours, they were inherited, absorbed, copied from environments and people that shaped your structure without asking permission. If this part spoke to you, comment, "I'm seeing myself," or "the pattern is showing up." Only those who have started looking inward understand the weight of this. And when you begin investigating the origin of these patterns, the discovery is even more unsettling. Much of what you call "my way" may never have really been yours. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was adaptation. Maybe it was an emotional architecture silently built while you did not even understand what you were absorbing. The human mind learns before it even understands. It records tones of voice. It records subtle rejections. It records absences. It records small humiliations. It records the fears of the environment. And then it turns all of that into automatic behavior. You grow up thinking you chose to be distrustful, hypervigilant, distant, anxious, controlling, quiet, or excessively rational, when in reality many of those structures were intelligent protective responses created by a psyche that needed to survive. That is an enormous shock. Because the initial feeling is, so not even my thoughts are entirely mine? In many cases, no. Carl Jung spoke about the powerful influence of psychic complexes, emotional cores loaded with memory, fear, and meaning, which begin interfering with the way we perceive the world without us being fully conscious of it. These complexes function like invisible lenses. You do not see reality as it is. You see reality filtered through what your mind has learned to fear, desire, or avoid. That is why two people can live through the exact same situation and interpret it in completely different ways. Because each one is looking through their own unconscious patterns. And when your mind begins to change, one of the first abilities that emerges is precisely this: you begin to distrust your own immediate perception. At first, this seems bad. It feels like instability. It feels like confusion. But it is a profound psychological advancement. Because before, you felt something and immediately believed what you felt. Now you feel, and ask, is this the present speaking, or is this an old pattern? That simple question changes everything. Because it creates space between stimulus and reaction. Space between emotion and interpretation. Space between the trigger and the truth. And it is in that space that mental freedom is born. A freedom that is small at first, almost fragile, but extremely powerful. You begin to realize that not every fear deserves obedience. That not every sadness represents failure. That not every rejection means worthlessness. That not every emotional urgency needs to become action. Your mind stops being dragged by every internal wave and gradually begins to observe the ocean. That is psychic maturity. But there is an unexpected side effect: the more awareness you gain, the harder it becomes to coexist with people who live completely fused with their own impulses. You begin noticing how many people act without perceiving themselves. How much they attack without understanding their own pain. How much they manipulate without admitting their own neediness. How much they run without recognizing their own fear. And that creates a new kind of loneliness. It is not just the loneliness of not being understood. It is the loneliness of seeing the mechanism while so many still blindly believe the first emotion they feel. You begin talking to someone and realize you are not speaking only with the person, you are speaking with their defenses, their wounds, their conditioning. Many relationships start to feel like dialogues between masked unconscious minds. That is tiring. That is draining. And sometimes it makes you crave silence because silence feels less confusing than certain human interactions. But here there is an essential turning point: this perception did not come to pull you away from life. It came to reposition you within it. Because when you understand that many of your patterns are inherited and many of other people's patterns are too, a rare ability is born: the ability to stop reacting as if everything were personal. Not every coldness from someone else is about you. Not every rejection is about you. Not every inconsistency is about you. Many times, you are simply crossing paths with people governed by structures they themselves do not understand. That understanding lifts an enormous weight off your chest. You begin suffering less over the surface and observing the origin more. You internalize less. You personalize less. You begin to understand that a great part of human pain is unconscious people colliding with wounded people. And maybe for the first time you realize that the true change of the mind is not only in seeing patterns, but in no longer being their prisoner. But there is one final stage, and perhaps the most powerful of all, when this perception stops being just understanding and begins transforming into an inner force that completely changes the way you occupy the world. If this resonated with you, comment, "It wasn't mine, I learned it," or "I'm coming off autopilot." These phrases activate something important in those who have already started awakening. And it is in this final stage that the change stops being merely mental, and starts becoming presence. Because up to this point you were perceiving patterns, observing scripts, questioning automatic emotions, dismantling conditioning. All of that is internal. All of that happens in silence. But there comes a moment when this accumulated awareness begins altering the way you enter a room, the way you respond to provocation, the way you deal with loss, the way you hold your own value without needing constant confirmation. The psyche changes, and the energy changes with it. You stop vibrating in the same collective desperation. And people feel that, even without knowing how to explain it. They feel it because before, you reacted immediately. Now, you filter. Before, you needed to be understood. Now, you understand that not everyone will have the capacity for that. Before, you sought emotional validation. Now, you observe who is actually capable of offering something real. Before, any outside instability invaded your center. Now, there is a quieter core that does not move so easily. That is psychological power. Not that loud kind of power that tries to look superior. But the rare power of not being hijacked by every stimulus in the world. Carl Jung said that those who look outward dream, but those who look inward awaken. And awakening does not mean having all the answers. It means no longer being blindly governed by the wrong questions. Your mind stops asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and starts asking, "What is this revealing?" Do you see the difference? One question places you as the victim of chaos. The other places you as the conscious observer of the experience. That shift in psychic position completely changes your strength. Because the person who only suffers events lives in a state of erosion. But the person who reads events as information begins turning pain into understanding, conflict into insight, frustration into refinement. Nothing stops hurting completely. But almost everything starts teaching. And when life starts teaching more than it wounds, your presence changes. You become less available for mind games. Less thirsty for empty attention. Less impressionable in front of masks. Less dependent on the approval of those who still live in superficiality. Not because you became cold, but because you started recognizing value in depth, not in noise. That is the feeling that something inside you has become more solid. A kind of inner spine. Things still happen, of course. There are still confusing days. There are still triggers. There are still emotional relapses. But now there is an awakened observer behind the movement. You no longer lose yourself entirely inside what you feel. There is a part of you that keeps seeing. And that part that keeps seeing prevents you from fully returning to the old unconsciousness. That is why, after a certain point, you can never be the same person again. You may try acting like before. You may try fitting into old environments. You may try repeating old responses. But internally, something no longer cooperates. Because the expanded mind suffers when it is forced to fit into small structures. You feel discomfort in shallow conversations. You feel exhaustion in predictable relationships. You feel strangeness in emotional patterns you once accepted. And sometimes you even feel guilty for changing so much. As if you were becoming too distant from everything. But maybe the truth is something else. You are not becoming distant from life. You are becoming distant from what kept you asleep inside it. That creates a different kind of confidence. Not the artificial confidence of believing you control everything. But the deep confidence of knowing that even when chaos comes, you can observe the chaos without completely dissolving inside it. That is a strength few people develop. Because most people want immediate relief. Few are willing to pass through the awareness required to build depth. And those who do begin to carry an invisible signature: less haste, less naivety, less dependency, more perception, more center, more discernment. Your mind changes, and along with it, your field of tolerance changes. You stop accepting just anything simply to avoid being alone. You stop chasing every answer just to silence anxiety. You stop interpreting every absence as the end of the world. There is more space between you and the collective panic. But this brings us to the most important question of all. If your mind is truly changing, how do you tell the difference between a legitimate awakening and just a phase of psychological estrangement? Because not every internal confusion is evolution, but some signs clearly show when there is no turning back. If this message made sense to you, comment, "I'm becoming more solid," or "I don't react the same anymore." That helps identify who is truly crossing this turning point. If you made it this far, it is because some part of this message did not just pass through your ears, it passed through you. And when a video does not merely inform, but reveals things you have been feeling and could not name, that means you are exactly on the kind of journey this channel was made to follow. So I want to make you a very direct invitation: if this content awakened something in you, if at any point you recognized yourself in these words, if you realize that your mind truly no longer functions the way it used to, subscribe to the channel now. Because the next videos will dive even deeper into this process of consciousness, psychological awakening, reading human patterns, shadow work, the unconscious mind, and inner transformation, and you will not want to miss this sequence. I also really want to hear from you in the comments. Does this message reflect what you feel? Have you been noticing these patterns inside yourself and in the world around you? Write below the phrase that impacted you the most, or simply comment, "My mind is changing." I read the comments, and they help build a community of people who are going through the same silent turning point. And of course, leave your like on this video, because that shows the algorithm that this kind of message needs to reach more people who are confused, feeling displaced, and needing to understand that there is a transformation happening inside them. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this, someone who has been noticing too much, feeling too much, questioning too much, and perhaps still does not know why. And most importantly, do not stop here. The next video was chosen exactly for those who are in this stage of awakening, and it will show you even deeper signs that your consciousness is coming off autopilot. Click on the next video now and continue this journey with me. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next video.